There's a story that after World War II, many years after World War II, some American soldiers landed on some small island off the coast of Japan. And on this small island, they found a man in a Japanese military uniform who immediately saw these American soldiers and assumed them to be the enemy. It took a long time to convince this man that the war, World War II, was actually over and had been over for, I think, decades at this point, or at least several years. In fact, it took the man's commanding officer, who had retired from the Japanese army at this point, to come to him on this island and tell him to stand down. This poor man had been on this small island off the coast of Japan and told to watch it and guard it for a long time by himself at this point. He didn't even know that the war was over. There's also stories of after the USSR fell, that very rural communities, small ones deep within Russia, 20, 30 years afterwards, still had no idea that they were not, in fact, part of the USSR, but were, in fact, known as Russia at this time. We talk a lot about things called information on a need-to-know basis. That there is information out there that only certain people in power or certain people who are important enough need to know. And the rest of us simply do not need to know that information. We have this idea that information, news, things that can possibly change the way that we see the world, first comes to those in charge, and then it's distributed to the rest of us in some fashion that the people in charge see fit. You're going to be reading today Luke 2 and Matthew 2, and what you're going to realize is that the angels, when they come, it's not on a need-to-know basis, or if it is, they don't go to the leaders, they don't go to the priests, they don't go to the kings. Instead, they start by going to shepherds to tell the shepherds, the lowest of the low in the community, that Christ had come, that salvation was here, and that the world would be forever changed. In Luke chapter 2, it says that when the angels come, their glory shines all around them as they come to speak to the shepherds. And they tell them that they bring them good news and great joy to the shepherds, to the poorest people, to the people who are out there in the fields, smelling bad, working with animals, and who the people in the cities simply did not like, because when the shepherds came into town, it meant that they were going to be a nuisance for them within the city. The angels come to the poorest of the poor first. They come and tell them that Christ is born, and the shepherds go and see him. And you'll read in one of our articles today that the shepherds are the first people who were actually preachers of the gospel, according to Luke. Now you leave Luke and you go to Matthew, and Matthew doesn't talk about shepherds. Instead, Matthew talks about King Herod, the king of the Jews and on the throne in the time of Jesus' birth. And it says that when the wise men, and we'll talk about them next week, but when the wise men come and ask where this king of the Jews is to be found, that Herod is actually very troubled by the news that he hears. The shepherds find good news and great joy as the shining, glorious light of the angels come and talk to them. Herod finds it to be very disturbing that a king is born somewhere under his kingdom. I picture him pacing up and down the halls of his palace. There's no mention of any lights on in the Bible for him. The shepherds have glorious light from the angels. Herod walks around in darkness. The question then becomes, who is this good news for? Who is this great joy for? And the narrative makes it clear that the good news is not for the people who are in power, that the great joy is coming to those who don't have power, the ones who are not necessarily on a need-to-know basis for information. The The people who would have been stranded out in rural Russia, and the people who were lost and forgotten on these islands after World War II. The good news comes to those who are forgotten, those who are the poorest, and those who are looked down upon. It doesn't come to the king who is sitting on the throne at the time. Information goes to the lowest and not to the highest. It's a radical reversal of the order of the world at this time. Christmas itself is a radical reversal. It's about taking those who are on the bottom of society and elevating them to the top. It's about people who are in power receiving a warning that if they don't look for the good news in the right places, then they will lose power. You know what happens when Herod hears about this? He goes on to murder children 2 years and younger. The shepherds, however, receive great news and great joy. It's a radical reversal. Christ comes, and suddenly the people who are of need to know are the ones who find the great news and the great joy. And the ones who are disturbed the most are the ones who are sitting in power. What does this say to us now as we think about the Christmas season? Where do we find ourselves? Are we hearing good news and great joy? Or are we troubled by the fact that maybe we're not receiving what we feel like we deserve? Christmas is a time of great reversal. God has come. God is not holding it over us, but God has come to us in the form of a baby. The entire world saved by a helpless little baby boy born outside and who has to flee because his life is in danger. It's a reversal of the way that anybody would ever assume that the world would be saved.